So I want to welcome everyone back to the conference and to our second panel entitled International Orders Across Time and Space. So my name's Peter Trubowitz. I have the great pleasure of chairing this panel. So I think the original motivation for this panel was to get us to take a step back from the current moment and reflect and maybe get concrete about other international orders and the moments of creation and destruction that accompanied them. And I'm not sure where our panelists come down on the question of ordering moments in view of the last panel, but our marching orders are to think about other international orders, their causal logics, and what lessons their operation as well as their rise and demise might hold for us today. These are big and difficult issues, but fortunately we have a crackerjack group of panelists to help us jumpstart the conversation. They include Harold James, Andrew Phillips, Natasha Wheatley, and my old colleague, Arnie Wested, and you can find their impressive bios in the PDF that the conference organizers have circulated. But very briefly, Harold James is the Claude and Laura Kelly Professor in European Studies and Professor of History and International Affairs in the Wilson School at Princeton. His most recent book is Making a Modern Central Bank, the Bank of England, 1979 to 2003, and that's with Cambridge. Andrew is Associate Professor in International Relations and Strategy at the University of Queensland. His most recent book, actually it's due out in September, is How the East Was Won, Barbarian Conquerors, Universal Conquest, and the Making of Modern Asia. That's with Cambridge. Natasha Wheatley is Assistant Professor in the Department of History at Princeton. She is most recently the co-editor of Remaking Central Europe, the League of Nations and the Former Habsburg Lands with Oxford. And Arnie Wested is the Elihu Root, or just the Elihu Professor of History and Global Affairs at Yale. His most recent book is Empire and Righteous Nation, 600 Years of China-Korea Relations, and that's 2021 with Harvard. So the ground rules are the same as the last panel. Each panelist will take 10 minutes to offer some initial comments and thoughts, and then we'll open it up to wider conversation. So you can just put your questions to us in the chat. So we picked straws, actually I picked them. And we're going to go in the following order. Harold's going to start us off, followed by Andrew, then Natasha. And today, Arnie is batting cleanup. Harold, the platform is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Peter. Thank you, John. It's really great to be with you and to be over all these different time zones. I think this panel is different in content in that we have a lot of historians and we're going to think about things, I think, in a slightly different way. But on the other hand, we're really going to pick up these themes from the first panel. And the theme that Bill Wohlforth just left us with before the virtual coffee break about whether politics change or don't change, I think is really fundamental to this. So I've been thinking for a long time about the waxing and waning of globalization. I've been thinking about moments in which globalization really surged or took off. And those moments in particular in the recent period, in the recent 2 centuries, are exactly the ones that Barry Buzan identified in the first panel. The 1840s are really transformative and they push a new era of globalization, and the 1970s are also the constitutive era for a different sort of globalization. And both of those, I think, are eras, they're not ordering moments at all, they're disordering moments, they're chaotic moments, they're moments of acute shortage, food shortages in the 1840s, most prominently petroleum shortages, oil shortages in the 1970s, but over a whole range of other areas. And it's coping with those shortages that drove a more chaotic world to be in being. What I wanted to do in the brief time this morning is to think about the way in which political systems change and respond to this. And I wanted to pick up one term, which, because the first session was so much devoted to thinking about Robert Gilpin, is already very much in the debate, hegemony. Well, hegemon, if we treat it as a historical exercise, it's obviously a very old word, and it comes from the consideration of how the Greek world of states was organized. The Greek word hegemon means leader or commander, but it's also used at that time as well in antiquity to describe the position of a dominant state in an association or league of states in the Hellenic League, as organized by Philip II of Macedon. And that's loosely managed by a governing body of delegates, and that's sometimes compared to the League of Nations or the United Nations, the Synedrion. There's a narrower executive council, the Proedroi, with 5 members chosen by lot, looks a bit like the Security Council. The leader of the League, or the hegemon, was undoubtedly unambiguously Macedon, and its ruler, Philip II, and then his son, Alexander the Great. They attacked other states that violated the rules of the League. They gave the Synedrion the authority to pass judgment on Thebes, for instance. They implement the decisions of the council. But as the power grows of the Macedonians, they start to violate their own rules, and they start to violate the rules of the League. And that prompts a rethinking, and in the end, it's the beginning of a disintegration of this system. And that little vignette, I think, could be an eternal vignette. That's Britain in the 19th century in the eyes of many people. You remember Britain is supposed to be supervising, or the British courts are supervising, the law of a globalized world. But Britain is increasingly, as its power wanes, playing fast and loose with the rules, so that people used to say, this was the favorite line that I grew up with, it's not a case of Britannia ruling the waves, but of Britannia waving the rules. And we think of exactly, I think, that kind of story in the 20th century Russian as well. It's so well known that I think it doesn't need any repetition. But I wanted to contrast that usage of hegemon with the usage that I think is more current with political scientists. And it's great to have Bob Cohane on the line in this, because Bob has really given the clearest and cleanest functional definition of a hegemon as you in the political science world use it: the country willing and able to pay the cost of maintaining the system, even in the face of defection. The hegemon must not only be strong, but be willing and able to carry the financial burden of others. To be, this is a quotation from Bob, to be considered hegemonic in the world political economy, a country must have access to crucial raw materials, control major sources of capital, maintain a large market for imports, and hold comparative advantages in goods with high value added, yielding relatively high wages and profits. Well, that I think does accurately describe the United States for some parts of the late 20th century, but it really doesn't even describe Britain in the 19th century, Britain had some natural resources, a lot of coal, but not other raw materials, quite dependent as a result on foreign trade that it needs to dominate by financial means. And there's a connecting line, I think, between that kind of domination, which in part is racialized as part of colonial rule, and then people today will also make comparisons with the story of how a imperial power at home can be brutal and brutalizing as well. But it doesn't describe Britain in the 19th century. It doesn't describe previous countries that may have thought of themselves for some brief time as hegemonic. It doesn't describe Napoleon's empire. It doesn't describe the Spanish Habsburgs. In fact, most of history is about a multiplicity of states and a kind of attempt then to work with that multiple state order. And some of the concepts that we have for that, balancing, for instance, that comes out of the world of early modern Italy, the Italian city-states. So that's Guicciardini, the great historian, describing the process of how the balance is interrupted by the French invasion in the 1490s, but how the balancing still results from that. So we have here then a story that hegemony, if there is hegemony, it doesn't really last for very long. I think we're going to get to this concept more tomorrow. I don't want to say too much. I'm looking forward to, in particular, to Yan Zhetong's presentation, because he's recently fascinatingly thought about exactly that historical parallel of how the rise of China and the decline of the United States is parallel to the story of the gradual eclipse of Britain in the late 19th century. And he memorably put this in terms of the United States is simply going to follow the path that Britain has already gone on. But there is a difference, and it's really, I think, been highlighted by the discussion in the first panel, and it brings you back to Gilpin, that what really pushes these collapses of hegemonic systems in the past were wars. And I think it is right to say that if we think of the gradual erosion of the American position, it's to do with two wars. It's to do with Vietnam, and it's to do with Iraq in 2003. So we do see the way in which even non-complete, non-total wars can lead to the substantial erosion of a position. And maybe that's a thought to carry on, that even in the nuclear age, you can have wars that really fundamentally affect the way in which states are perceived, and in the way in which their legitimacy is perceived. In that setting, I think it's fascinating to think about whether there can be other replacements, new hegemons, and there's a lot of attention given to that. Can Europe, for instance, constitute itself as a United States of Europe and be more powerful, or can Germany be the leader of the free world in 2017? There were some people who were suggesting that, or in 2017 as well, that China and Germany together would defend the existing sort of globalization in the light of the challenges from the UK and from the United States. But that's fundamentally, it seems to me, rather wishful thinking. This is a world that is emerging that looks very much like the world when Alexander the Great passes away, obviously in the case of Alexander, at a quite early age, and the world lives not with hegemony, but with the aftermath of hegemony. And that, of course, is the title of a book by Bob Cohen. Thank you.
Harold, thank you very much, and especially for kind of connecting this back to the previous panel and Gilpin and drawing the parallel to the Macedonians. Andrew, it's 11 p.m. there, I think, right?
It is.
Yes.
Filled with ready to go.
Okay, the platform is yours.
Terrific. Thank you. It's wonderful to be with such esteemed scholars. What I would like to do in my 10 minutes is to try to make the case for why the imperial past of early modern Asia may be a useful resource for us in thinking about the evolution of international orders. And this focus on early modern Asia, which comes out of the most recent book, it very much derives from a dissatisfaction I have with what I see as a bias in a lot of the way that we think about international order that still typically comes from a fairly Eurocentric perspective that I think overemphasizes the tendency for pluralism to persist within international systems, and in particular for mechanisms like the balance of power, like great power concerts or other constitutional orders, to preserve a degree of pluralism within international systems. That is a story that to a degree potentially does work imperfectly in the European context. It does not work in the context of early modern Asia. Instead, if we look at either South Asia or East Asia, the story of the 16th through to the mid-19th century is actually a story in which universal conquest is more common than the preservation of pluralism. For example, in India from 1526 onwards, we see the upstart Timurid house eventually acquiring a position by 1707 of system-wide dominance. Likewise, the Manchus in early modern Northeast Asia from the 1590s onwards, by 1644, they have deposed the Ming dynasty. And finally, of course, the East India Company from a period 1765 through to 1850, conquering India once again. So there is a tendency in international systems during this critical warm-up period of modernity for domination to prevail rather than a balance of power or some form of constitutionalism. What I want to do is to unpack a few of the mechanisms that enabled system-wide universal empires to consolidate during this period. And again, noting the curiosity of this tendency, the reason that it's counterintuitive is that whether it's the Mughals, the Manchus, or the British, these are demographically insignificant players within the systems that they conquer. They do not possess system-dominating military technological advantages, and they are quite often coming up against stigmas of being cultural outsiders. So the factors that I've focused in on and that I think are really particularly interesting in the early modern period. The first is that both South and East Asia during this period have a degree of commercial permeability, which enables a new form of frontier capitalized coercion to develop during this period. To give you an instance of this, the East India companies are famous for having developed massive super profits through arbitrage of buying spices low and then selling them high in Europe. But there is an analogy in Northeast Asia where the Manchus initially corner the market for the production of ginseng, and as a result, through their involvement with trade with Ming China, end up actually siphoning off a very large percentage of the New World silver coming in to China via Manila. So there's a new form of capitalized coercion that develops during this period. A second element, again, these cultural systems that exist in both East Asia and also in South Asia. In East Asia, there is a programmatic commitment among the Confucian literati to a model of Confucian cosmopolitanism. There is a similar analogous system of cosmopolitanism among the lettered elites in South Asia in the form of Persianate conceptions of universal kingship. What I notice that those are universalistic civilizing projects, if you like, that were intended to tame the barbarians of the steppe. It was possible, though, precisely because of the cosmopolitanism of those ideologies, precisely because of the fact that they were separated from conceptions of ethnic proprietorship, that they could potentially be appropriated through a form of normative jujitsu and be taken up as legitimating ideologies to enable outside conquerors to establish and craft conquest coalitions from among Indigenous collaborators. The third element that I focus on in the argument is that both South and East Asia, there are key institutions that are capable of adoption, conversion or co-optation. In the case of India, the East India Company expands partially as a result of its ability to acquire monopolistic control of the world's largest ever market for mercenaries. The point of this admittedly rambling and hyperventilating tale that I'm trying to condense here is that if we look at the period of early modern globalization and we shift our focus from the insistent pluralism of Westphalian Europe, which I would argue is actually a bit of a sideshow from the Eurasian perspective, what we see instead is the very possibility of new forms of conquest from so-called barbarian outsiders being a critical factor in shaping the political geography of both South and East Asia, which we need to keep in mind are the key centres of population in the world then and now, but also the key centres of commercial wealth for much of that time. So what is the relevance of this in terms of thinking about international order from a historical to a more contemporary point of view? Well, I'll start with the basic lessons of what we can't learn from East and South Asia in the early modern period for today. Obviously, for reasons that have already been canvassed in part through the conversations that Dan raised about nuclear weapons earlier, there have been significant global systemic shifts that now prevent universal conquest of the kind that we saw in the early modern era. Not simply the emergence of weapon systems that make hegemonic war catastrophic, I would suggest also other key elements of modernity that have developed. So for example, the displacement of ritual in favour of positive international law as a key means of mediating relations between polities. A shift from widespread traditions of commercial extraterritoriality, which enabled entities like the East India Company to acquire a toehold in places like India in the first place, towards a system of sovereign territorial exclusivity. All of these features of modernity make the spectre of universal conquest as that kind of thing that shaped the political geography of South and East Asia in the 16th through 19th centuries. We can all breathe a sigh of relief. Unlikely to see that again. However, what I want to propose as a series of provocations is to really suggest that there are some broader analogies that we can draw from these earlier periods of universal conquest. And I'll reiterate a couple of features that enabled system-wide transitions of power, if you like, not so much ordering moments, but reordering episodes that occurred in these periods. And I'd suggest a couple that are relevant in the context of the contemporary liberal international order, and particularly looking at within the context of looking at the rise of China from the late 1970s in a larger context. What's notable in terms of the previous processes of hegemonic transition in South and East Asia is first that these were commercially open systems. They enabled outsiders to infiltrate and to appropriate and siphon off the profits that were necessary to develop the material wherewithal to then develop the military capabilities to become system-wide challenges. The second is that there's an enormous amount of faith that has been invested in the last couple of decades about talking about the socialising power of liberal interdependence, the socialising power of liberal norms to bring potentially revisionist states into the international system. Liberalism is obviously a universal cosmopolitan ideology. There is a great degree of faith invested in its capacity to transform outsider actors, to bring them and socialise them into an existing system. It may be a bit of a stretch, but I would suggest that Persianate conceptions of civilization and universal kingship, the Confucian mission of civilizing the barbarians, were equally characterised by a degree of hubris in terms of their belief in their transformative ability to take outsiders and bring them into a system of order. What I would suggest in closing is that when we think about the mechanisms that people are focused about as being sources of resilience in the liberal international order, its commercial openness, its cosmopolitanism, its potentially socialising capacities, we need also think of the possibility of challenger actors exploiting that commercial openness, strategically mimicking conformity to liberal principles for a short amount of time while they develop a capability to challenge that system. And in so doing, I think we can potentially provide, I'm concluding on a somber note here, an additional pathway for incremental challenge to international orders. And I'll stop there. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Andrew. And thank you very much for coming in on time. Those are great comments. Actually, both you and Harold were right on time. So Natasha, we've gone from Macedonia to East and South Asia. Where do we go next?
Everywhere. Good morning, everyone, or good evening. I'd like to also begin by thanking John and Toila and Chika for their collegial invitation, for their thoughtful curation of this event, and indeed for the rich conversations they've already opened up since the Reimagining World Order project launched last year. For this event, we've been invited to consider the rise and fall of world orders and the history and theory of ordering moments. To, in a moment of perceived crisis, step back and think about the resilience and fragility of international orders, their creation and their destruction. With this pocket of time I have, I'd like to take a further step back and ask some questions about the questions themselves, to reflect a little on the basis of their intelligibility. That is, from where they are sensical or natural or urgent. They themselves, I'd like to suggest, are archives of experiences and assumptions, symptoms and artifacts of the history we seek to analyze. I offer these thoughts as someone interested not only in the history of international law and international order, but also in the history of knowledge. Indeed, I'm particularly interested in their intertwining and co-implication, in the epistemological coordinates of international order, both for protagonists and actors and thinkers at different moments in the past, as well as for us in the disciplinary tools we employ as scholars today, in how we know what we know then and now, and in that understanding as a precondition for understanding differently. In this vein, we might first ask, when prompted to consider the rise and fall of international regimes, how we know if they have risen or fallen. Such assessments always involve prior assumptions about perspective or metric, as seen from where, on what basis. It may be that what feels like a rupture or a crisis from one place looks a lot like a continuity viewed from elsewhere. Here we might draw a loose analogy to the work of my co-panelist today, Orana Westad, whose landmark account of the global Cold War rezoned its major battlefields to the wars of decolonization. Crucially, that respatialization changed the object itself. As viewed from the decolonizing world, the US and the USSR looked less like ideological opposites, locked in a profound ideological dispute, and much more like Siamese twins possessed of a common makeup. These two rival high modernisms shared their universalism, a profound faith in progress, and the project of remaking the world in their own image. The logic and consequences of intervention unfolded similarly, regardless of which one was doing the intervening. Analogously, much of our standard periodization and characterization of the history of international order makes sense only from very particular vantage points. Viewed from the Western capitals, 1919 and 1945 might seem to mark the birth of new orders, leading to particular questions about their rise and fall, and particular analyses of their nature and structure. Like all optical structures, this perspective reveals some things and occludes others. Viewed from many different parts of what we now call the global South, these junctures are characterized not by rupture, but by rather quite extraordinary continuity. They were moments in which Western powers overcame countervailing pressures to hold tight to the legitimacy, even necessity of empire. They were moments in which Western statesmen worked very hard to keep so many structures in the same. Vocabularies may have changed and new institutions may have appeared, but their assumptions and their results were often not substantially different, as viewed from the colonial ground level. For the majority of the world's population then, other sorts of junctures may seem like more obvious inflection points in the making and unmaking of world orders. Our first thought might be of global decolonization in the decades after World War II, with its radical transformation in the roll call of world sovereigns. But here too, a more thorough shift in perspective invites us to take a further step, one that recasts the object itself. If we think with the anti-colonial activists and politicians who feature in Adom Getachu's recent instant classic World Making After Empire, for example, we see how they were driven to an analysis that did not simply frame empire as the problem, the sort of problem that could then be overcome through the replacement of alien rule with new one sovereignty. That change could occur, it turned out, without any deep or meaningful transformation in their profoundly subordinate position and their dependence on the great powers. A continuity that, we might note, has its disciplinary analogue in the expansion of international society narrative of Adam Watson and others, which frame the problem as one of exclusion giving way to inclusion, a change assimilable into existing paradigms, indeed even affirming existing paradigms, without structural or definitional challenges to the thing itself. Rather, Getachu's characters characterize the problem, characterize the world order, we could say, as one of dominance. What they fought against, both before and after formal independence, was dominance. To understand the fundamental structure of world order in these terms leads to different timelines and periodizations, different actors, different causes, different domains, drawing out attention especially to the hierarchies and structures of subordination written into the world economy, for example, as well as, of course, to race and to shifting iterations of what Jennifer Pitts has recently called Western parochial universalism. Whether we look to the Ghanaian leader Kwame Nkrumah's 1965 text, Neocolonialism, or the political theory of decolonization laid out in Getachu's own book, what is noteworthy is not the rise and fall of orders, but the remarkable persistence, the deep embeddedness and fierce tenacity of that pattern of domination over the course of modern history. As we know, not least from many recent studies that have shown how the mid-century IR realist canon was shaped by thinkers, Morgenthau Carr and so on, reasoning from the violent traumatic events of 1940s Europe, taking the behavior of states like Germany in that period and extracting ostensibly universal lessons from them, our analytical tools do not stand outside the history of international order, but are rather its products. My own research pursues this entanglement, not for IR, but for international law. I'm interested in how the history of international legal knowledge is closely and intricately bound up with the transformations in sovereignty and international legal order, each acting in and on the other in different ways, in different moments. I'd like to sketch one example of that entangled state systems and knowledge systems taken from the monograph I'm finishing that gives us some specificity and texture to this larger point about continuity and discontinuity as profoundly situated phenomena. John Eichenberry has emphasized how liberal internationalism emerged in response to questions of modernity. International law, too, of course, had its own many-sided confrontation with the modern. A significant part of that story is what we can, in simplified terms, describe as the shift from natural law to positive law. Over the course of the 19th century, many European jurists sought to root out the fuzzier postulates of natural law and construct new, modern, scientific, objective legal knowledge with multifaceted implications. One was a perhaps ironic contraction of the formal community of international law, as the pluralism and flexibility of earlier dealings with non-Europeans hardened into a sharp distinction between civilized and uncivilized states and a heightened consciousness of European specificity. Crucially, in trying to move beyond accounts that anchored the legitimacy of law in nature or reason or God or divine right, positivism conceptualized law as something made by the state. If this shift sharpened questions about the status of international law, how could states truly bind themselves and so on, it had other less well-known consequences relevant for our story. Simply put, it made the birth and death of states juridically incomprehensible. If law was made by the state, produced by the state, then it could not already be in existence to govern and regulate the states coming into being. Thus, 19th century jurists cast the creation and eclipse of states as matters of fact and not law, law attached only to the finished fact of the state. This seemed like a relatively arcane issue in the 19th century, not only because of the relative stability of the European state system, but because of long-standing doctrines of the juridical immortality of the state. But never did those premises seem shakier or more inadequate than in the age of decolonization. The end of imperial sovereignty spurred a confrontation with what we can call the temporal edges of state life. It turned out, as Hans Kelsen put it, that states had borders in time and not only in space. This problem crystallized as a problem first for a cohort of Central European jurists reckoning with the end of the Habsburg Empire in 1918. The problem of the end of imperial sovereignty, one of the central themes of the 20th century, arrived early here. They began arguing that international law needed to be conceived as logically, jurisdictionally prior to states, even if it wasn't always historically prior to them. That it would provide the continuous legal order that bridged changes in sovereignty and banished legal vacuums. Now, interesting things happen as this knowledge problem as we move from the 1918 moment of imperial collapse in Europe to the global collapse of empire after World War II. Jurisdictional priority remained a key thread, but with the narrative signs reversed. For many global South jurists, the continuity and priority of international law was precisely the problem and not the solution. In committing them to honor the concessions and liabilities and obligations adopted by former imperial rulers, the postulate of legal continuity bound these post-imperial states into structures of economic subordination and stripped self-determination of its emancipatory potential. For them, often, the existing order was the problem. Reckoning with this structure and experience allows us to cut into our themes and questions from a non-hegemonic perspective. If the vast majority of the world's states came into being in the 20th century, they did so after modern international law. They were born into an incredibly thick web of rules and obligations and commitments and structures and institutions that radically constrained their room to move. Thus, we might ask, whose question is it about the rise and fall of orders? Who is invested in continuity and why? When we refer to continuity and change in international order, which bits do we think are changing? Perceptions of fragility or robustness of the international legal order might be profoundly local. Very particular perspectives and historical experiences come sedimented into the syntax of our disciplinary questions. IR's quintessential problems about states confronting external anarchy, about when and how they overcome or channel their self-interest or full autonomy to create international orders are, we might say, dramatically at odds with the experience of the majority of the world's states, born not into anarchy, but into the stranglehold of order. The basic syntax of that classical problem that begins with states as the first facts and reasons toward the world is one that makes sense from the perspective of a relatively small number of very powerful states, most of which were already in existence in the 19th century. That syntax is a luxury. That syntax is a whole history in condensed form. As we think about continuities and historical toolkits and mechanisms, we might also want to consider the continuities in our disciplinary toolkits too, about what the questions themselves have already decided and what they have foreclosed. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha, for those reflections and also for bringing the question or the issue of law and institutions really kind of directly into the conversation that actually links back to the question that was asked about institutions in the previous panel. Arnie, the platform is yours.
Thanks, Peter. It's great to see you again. Reminds me of the old days in London. I heard the pubs have reopened now, at least for
Indeed,
service outdoors. So
God help us.
Well, I know what I'm missing. So I'm still thinking about Harold's and Andrew's and Natasha's wonderful presentations. So I'll try to get back to some of the points that they made in the discussion later on. What I'll try to do briefly is to look at two cases of international orders that I've been preoccupied with of late, neither of which, perhaps to the surprise of some in the audience, is the Cold War. The first one comes out of the book that Peter mentioned that I've just finished on the long-term relationship between China and Korea. And that book starts with having a more in-depth study of what you could call the Neo-Confucian international system that arose in post-Mongolian East Asia, sort of towards the end of the 14th century, which was an international system, going to some of the points that Andrew made, but it was slightly earlier era, that was based on a search for order, setting out a new, very heavily ideologically based order with universalistic pretensions, coming out of the chaos that many elites within the region felt that the Mongols had left behind. Somewhat unfairly, we know today, but that was the view that was held. And at the core of this, in what becomes the Ming Empire and its various extensions, sits Neo-Confucianism, which is an ideology, a form of thinking about human relationships with the state and with each other, that come out of a much earlier period, so developed during the Sung and even during the Yuan, during the Mongol hegemony within the region, but was put into a system, a state-led system, as a kind of Neo-Confucian revolution in the early years of the Ming. This was the Ming justification for their rule and for their hegemony. I mean, to use that term, they would call themselves a daguo, a great state. Tim Brooks has pointed out recently, which is not entirely overlapping with hegemon or with empire, but sits somewhere in between. It certainly is an assertion of a leading position, predominant position within a state order, where the basic principle is that the other states that want to stand in any kind of meaningful position vis-a-vis that imperial center, that Ming daguo, will have to take over at least some elements of Neo-Confucian thinking to be recognized. So this is a very interesting kind of international system, I think, for two reasons when we think about it from today's perspective. This is hegemony in a very heavily ideological context, based at the outset as a kind of principle on assumed common values, at least among elites, which turned out to be very long-lived. There is obviously a break, as Andrew pointed out, with the Qing conquest in the early 17th century, but the system itself is remarkably stable, and it certainly holds as what our political science friends would call an epistemic community among the elites for about the next 500 years. Which is not saying that there isn't a lot of violence. There is, and there is a lot of conquest at the edges, but there is only one big international war in the midst of this. In the late 16th century, when Japan tries to undo the system to become the daguo instead of the daguo, to become the great state, which of course they fail in doing in the late 16th century, just as they do in the 20th century. So what can we draw from this one? I think several things. One, to put it provocatively, is that hegemony works can work for a relatively long period of time within a state system that is distinctly unipolar. When it is relatively unintrusive or even unobtrusive, more assumed than practiced. And that was certainly the Ming and Qing experience, I think, coming out of that time period, going all the way from the late 14th century and up to the mid 19th century, or even a little bit later than that. Korea is incredibly interesting to study with regard to this, because Korea existed fully within this system for a very long period of time, keeping some level of what we today would call sovereignty, but also gave off sovereignty or had mixed forms, hybrid forms of sovereignty with the daguo. that it was linked in a relationship with. So I think that's one of the systems that I think we need to think about today, not because today's China necessarily harks back to the Ming and Qing experience, but because there are issues that come out of the discourses that existed during that time period that I'm pretty sure we're going to see revived in various forms for the current setting. We're going to listen to Yan Xuetong tomorrow, who has been influenced by some of the thinking about that particular hegemonic era. So that's my first case of international orders. The other one, not surprising after what we heard in terms of Barry's presentation earlier on and what several others have said as well, Harold mentioned this, comes out of a project that I have just started, which deals with the transformations happened on a global scale in the mid-19th century. So basically from the 1840s to the very early 1860s. And I'm very interested in the changes that took place in the European imperial order during the long 19th century. I mean, in many ways, how it became a European imperial order, which it wasn't around 1800, because there were other strong empires at work, the Qing, the Ottomans, and others as we have already heard. But how, for various reasons not connected to technology and economic development, as Harold pointed out, this ended up being a Eurocentric order. So here the issue of sovereignty does come in. It's sovereignty for European states, or at least other European empires, in a setting which makes Britain primus inter pares, but still part of a system that is multipolar in many ways. And I'm trying to understand the relative stability for a reasonably long period, again interspersed with violence and wars at the fringes, that this system had, why it lasted as long as it did. Even overcoming instances of liberal interventionist agitation and attempts at making use of the system for slightly different purposes than what we found in the early period by Palmerston and others. But even that liberal interventionism, somewhat different from what we have seen in our own world of late, happened within very strict limits. And it dealt mainly with regions outside of Europe and the European fringes. Now, what's interesting about the discussion, I think, of this order, and it would be interesting to hear what people have to say about this, is that everyone assumed at the time that it was extra-European imperial rivalries that would destroy the peace, that would in the end undo the system that existed. This goes to some of Natasha's points as well. Instead, of course, it was the emergence from within the system of a new power that could not easily be accommodated, namely Germany, that led to its eventual undoing. And it's well worth to pause at this, I think, also in terms of what we can think about for our own time and age, and particularly on this critical issue that has come up on a number of occasions so far with regard to accommodation. So because of the emergence of Germany, the time in which it happened, the setting in which it happened, and that it dealt with the core, going back to various terms, rather than the periphery, of course, it was incredibly difficult to handle. Even if we are not dealing with what could be called systemic rivalries. So these are not the rival systems that are in emergence. It's within the same system in many ways. What could have led to a less dramatic and tragic outcome? Here we go back to the discussion we had about Gilpin. Obviously, international institutions, as many of the participants here will point out, played a role, but also lessening regional conflicts, I think, is of a key significance in terms of trying to understand what could have been done when things started to go seriously wrong in the early part of the 20th century. And lessening regional conflicts, especially when a rising power sees these conflicts as vital to the processes of its rise. And I think that's in a way the key to me that comes out of that particular state system in terms of what we can pick up today, that it is at that core that the conflicts must be sought and lessened or possibly even resolved. I'm always reminded of this moment when everyone in Berlin were arguing for Germany's continued expansion into Africa, and Bismarck sort of dragged these people by their ears into his office, unrolls a map of Europe, pointing to Russia on that side, France on that side, Germany in the middle, and he says, "This, gentleman, is my Africa." So concentrating on the issues where they really have arisen, where they are seen as central, I think is one of the big challenges coming out of any comparison that we can draw with our own world with regard to the 19th century.
Arnie, thank you very much. That's a terrific set of opening comments. We've got a little over a half an hour here to work with. I can see already that there's a question in the chat and then another in the Q&A box. So I guess they're coming in from both directions. So the platform is open. Let me first ask if there are any other members on the platform here who've got questions or want to pick up one of the threads that the panelists have raised. I think I would like to kind of push on, well, actually I saw a hand go up, so I'll start with Harold and hold my question. Harold, go ahead.
Oh, thanks. I didn't want to cut you off. I just had a couple of comments on these very interesting presentations. First of all, I think it was really very helpful to have Andrew's comments about the difference in the early modern period between the different ends of the Eurasian landmass, and looking for universal conquest at one end and looking at a balancing system at the other end. But I thought, Andrew, you went much too far when you said what's going on in Europe is a sideshow, because it's exactly that sideshow, the fact that there are multiple competing states, that, in my view, in the view of many people, I think, explains the extraordinary dynamism of early modern Europe. That is, that if one state does stupid things, so if Spain expels the Moranos and the Moriscos, or if France expels the Huguenots, there are other states who receive them. And the consequence of this multiplicity of states is exactly the kind of productive order we had about Bacon and Baconianism in the first session. But this is really the moment that Europe achieves a kind of intellectual dominance, and it's intimately connected with a multi-state system. And so I think, if you generalize that to today, that is exactly important in today's world, that we have different models, and we do things in different ways, and that we look at what they're doing and we learn from them, and we take the people who are persecuted in one area and intellectually, ethnically, religiously, and we are open. So in that sense, this kind of classic Enlightenment view of what the early modern European state could do is the way in which the modern world was cast, and really cast, I think, very productively. I mean, that's the origin of modern globalization. And then I had a brief comment on Arnie's point, and it's obviously an area on which an enormous amount of ink has been spilled and scholarly controversies have been fought over, but is the collapse of the system in 1914 the result of simply of the rise of Germany that can't be integrated? That again has unpleasant implications for the current world, because what Germany was doing was essentially to base a kind of very dynamic export economy on scientific progress and on beating Britain in science, in establishing all kinds of communications tools and so on. And so it was leapfrogging Britain. And it looks, and there are many, many analogies. I've done something on that as well, with Rosh Doshi and Marcus Brunnermeier, how that's analogous to the story of the Chinese-American relationship, and whether you think that German relationship necessarily descended into violence. There's another story that people can give about 1914, which I think is in a way a more plausible one. It's to do with really badly disintegrating empires. So it's to do with the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire in the first place, and it's in the Ottoman successor states that the really poisonous conflicts arise. But it's to do with the crumbling of the Habsburg Empire and the weakness of the Russian Empire. People put their emphases in different places there. Sean McMeekin's just done this very provocative book that puts the Russian story in the center of it. But I think the Ottoman story is absolutely crucial to the story of the unbalancing of the European system, because the Ottoman Empire was part of the European state system and disintegrated in the course of the 19th century.
Thank you, Harold. We've got a number of people with their hands up and also some questions from the audience. But before I go to them, Andrew, let me give you and Arnie a bite at the apple here, an opportunity to respond quickly to Harold.
Yes, you quite rightly called me out, Harold. That was deliberately a political exaggeration when I said Westphalia is a sideshow. I think it's probably emblematic, I think, of my frustration that a lot of international relations scholarship still seems to fixate on Westphalia. And I think the negative result of that, apart from inherent parochialism to that, is that this sort of notion of, well, there's a sequence of hegemonic challenges, Philip II, Louis XIV, Napoleon, Kaiser Wilhelm II and Hitler, and they're all successively defeated. I think that Whiggish narrative in some ways breeds a degree of complacency when thinking about contemporary challenges in the international system. I think it loads the dice in people's historical imaginary to presume that balancing rather than universal domination is going to prevail. The one qualifier that I would make, because I don't want to entirely walk back the observations that I made, I do think that we need to be careful about suggesting that there is an irrepressible dynamism that comes out of Europe's political pluralism that, if you like, makes it the sole incubator of modernity. One of the things that I find fascinating in terms of taking a Eurasian perspective is that, in part, it's the pull of Asian prosperity that develops as a result of the success of projects of universal domination, the Mughals in South Asia, the Qing in East Asia, that draws Europeans to develop institutions like the chartered company state in order to try to plug into and harness that wealth. So I think there's actually a more interesting story of an interaction between Asian universal empire and European Westphalian fragmentation that I think is lost if we focus exclusively on either one of those.
Arnie?
Just very briefly to Harold's very good and essential question. So the reason why I underlined the aspects of what you could call regional conflict, which you could for 1914 is about the Balkans, but not just about the Balkans, is that that's one of the aspects that would have to be dealt with differently if we were to have a different outcome. On the other hand, going back to the discussion that we've been having about Gilpin's work, it seems to me fundamental to understand that that doesn't that those conflicts, those challenges of crumbling empires, do not arise out of a vacuum. They arise out of a situation that is already there, that is intimately connected to the dislocations within the system that happened because of Germany's rise. Right? So this is a moment that we need to look at if we want to understand, you know, the outbreak of the First World War and why this happens in the summer of 1914. Absolutely. But we also need to think about this in that broader sense. What is it in that structural sense, in terms of the developmental aspects of this that you have written about, others have written about before, that we need to understand better, to think about this period in a broader sense. And that's what's brought me back to that earlier period from 1840 to 1860, when this system, as you pointed out, Harold, was created. Right? And it was created in a very dramatic fashion. So maybe there is something there. We'll see when this book is finished.
So I'm going to turn, we have, I think, Jennifer, you had your hand up first, then Tolia, and then Dan Dudney. And then I'm going to turn to the audience. Bob Cohen has a very good question that connects back to the previous panel. So, so Jennifer, the platform's yours.
Great, thank you very much. I just want to draw out Natasha a bit further on some of her fascinating points. And I think, firstly, I have three small questions to ask of her, which I think will really help our discussion. The first is that she seems to suggest, when we think about law's role in both constituting and managing international order, we look at different inflection points. And of course, the one she points to is the shift from natural law to positive law. And I just wanted to ask her, though, about what many would see as that being a false, dichotomy, that we continue to have aspects of natural law that complicate the maintenance of forms of international order as we move into the 20th century and beyond, right? So it arises in a new form, and I wonder if she agrees with that. Secondly, and I'm very glad that Robert Cohen's part of this conversation, because it seems to me she's also suggesting that we can think about law's role in order in different ways, right? We can think of it akin to an institution. It's playing a functionalist role in managing relations between states, but yet her remarks suggest that that might be a limited conception, because we are dealing with a very particular historical configuration of international law, not law in the abstract, but a body of international law that develops over the course of the 19th and 20th century that has very specific historically grounded rules. And that suggests to me that when we conceptualize the role of law, we have to be aware of that. My third question is really about your discussion, which I thought was fascinating, about how new states, and I agree with you that that moment of new state creation after 45 is critical for thinking about at least our contemporary order, is a moment in which new states have to take on a set of burdens which law essentially dumped on them. But also whether we can think of those rules as highly enabling, right? So there is or those burdens as being also gifts in a way. So and I'm going to talk about this a little bit tomorrow. I mean, one of the episodes that I think is really important for the post-45 period is actually the Biafran War, for all kinds of reasons. Firstly, it gives rise to, a whole generation of humanitarian actors. But secondly, it's a moment in which many developing states rally around a particular territorial order, and law is supportive of that. And so a bid for self-determination from a particular group that could have seen further disintegration of states, further disorder, is essentially quashed. And many developing states actually support that move, support a particular interpretation of self-determination. And so I just wonder if we can wholly think about this as taking on burdens, or whether it's actually a more mixed story about what that historically grounded system of international law enables new states to do. And of course, it's their elites, Natasha, not their, their populations writ large. But I wanted to thank you very much, because I think you've really introduced an interesting set of questions for us that I hope will linger over the next couple of days.
Natasha, before we move on, let me give you an opportunity to respond to this. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Peter. And thank you so much, Jennifer. Yes, I mean, in broad terms, I'm in agreement with everything you say there. The positive law, natural law thing, of course, it's a much more nuanced story. For the purposes of a very short paper like this, I had to kind of home in on some very schematic shifts. But in some ways, one of the most interesting stories, right now in particular, is about this return of all these natural law ideas, right? Especially to do with dignity and so on and so forth. So there's a variegated story there, not only for the 19th century, but also about the 20th century history of natural law ideas as well. So, and then there's so much interesting work going on precisely that problem, as you probably know. About how to think about law's role in these shifts in modern history, as I've discussed. Yet what I'm really interested in is the way in which different phases of this historical development of the state system and of sovereignty, code certain questions into these disciplinary frameworks, right? Like they get abstracted from very particular, often regional problems into ostensibly abstract or general principles, and then get reapplied to different regions. So we can definitely see that in international law reckoning with the end of imperial sovereignty after 1918 and absorbing certain kind of lessons and questions and problems. And then that looks quite different, or it has particular other effects when it's applied, to decolonizing states in the 45 period. And in these questions to do with state succession, it's absolutely fascinating, because the question re-loops back to Europe at the end of the Cold War, right? When you've got all these questions to do with succession from the Soviet Union. And so, this loop between general international legal principles and different kind of regional clusters of issues over the course of the 20th century is an absolutely fascinating story, and it helps us think about this kind of interplay between particularism and universalism in a much more historically dynamic way, I think. I might not go so far as to use your term gifts in terms of, but I absolutely agree with you. I mean, this is one of the fascinating things about international law. It's which a number of scholars like Cynthia Pahuja and others in her Decolonizing International Law have really honed in on, in that it is a structure that has enshrined so much power and hierarchy, and yet it always holds out the promise of emancipatory ends as well, right? I mean, and embedded in the very idea, of law is that you can pick it up and use it against, right? That it's universally available to be, attemptably reapplied and used for other ends than it was originally framed to do. And I think you're right that a really interesting iteration of that is, you talked about Biafra and questions of secession. As you know, there's really interesting work about this whole idea of self-determination as a one-time right? The way in which these decolonizing post-colonial states, want to enshrine self-determination as an international legal right, but that should only be something that applies once, right? You can't just keep seceding, right? They want to protect their own territorial integrity and not to be able to enshrine their territorial parameters, as you say. And so that's another way into thinking about this relationship of history and law, right? Where not only evolving through history, but also with particular temporal properties that people have particular interests invested in preserving. So much more to say about so many of those things, but I know time is limited, and I'll leave it there.
That's great. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Tolia and Dan and Rosemary to each frame their comment, and then I'm going to turn to Bob Cohane's question and frame it similar to something I wanted to ask, and we'll open it up to all the panelists at that point. So Tolia, the platform's yours.
Thanks, Peter. One of the themes that came through very strongly for me in this panel is the importance of culture as a force in shaping international orders. different panelists invoke this in different ways. Arnie, for example, spoke of the Neo-Confucian order that bound China and Korea for a very long time. Andrew, you spoke of the universal civilizing mission of the early Eurasian empires. And of course, Natasha, the transition from natural law to positive law that you spoke about very often is narrated in terms of the emergence of this common world imperial culture that bound the European order together. There is, and Harold, likewise with the discussion of Macedonian hegemony, that narrative is saturated with a sense of a common culture binding the order together. The question that I want to put to you takes as its point of departure Martin White's very famous observation that a common culture is absolutely necessary for there to be an international society rather than simply an international system. Reformulating that observation slightly, the question that I want to put to you is, to what extent is a common culture necessary for international stability? It's obviously not sufficient. Arnie, as you noted, it was possible in that Neo-Confucian context, even for states sharing a common culture, to wage war on one another. International stability is perfectly possible. So it's not a sufficient condition. But to what extent is a common culture a necessary condition for international stability in your view? And if you do believe that it is necessary, do you see the causal salience of a common culture as a force for international stability varying through history, in particular with where we find ourselves today, arguably in a situation where the states of the international community are not bound by a common culture? Is that a force for instability or stability in a comparative macro-historical context? Thank you.
Okay, that's great kind of mechanism type question for the panel. Panelists. Dan, I think I have you next. You have to unmute yourself, Dan. We're still in.
I'll make a comment, really. These are excellent presentations, extremely sophisticated, and I learned a lot, actually. And they're all in the vein of, in Gilpin's terms, systemic processes, systemic change, hegemonies, empires, waning and expanding and so forth, relative power shifting. And I'd like to make an observation about really virtually everything I heard on this panel, which was that it's leaving out, for the periods that you're looking at, the biggest change that brackets all other changes. And that's globalization itself, in the sense that the globe, as the planet's surface, is for the first time now part of one system of practical interaction. This is an enormously revolutionary change, right? It had been subsystem dominant in Barry's language prior to this. And some of the systems were completely isolated. The Mayans and the Aztecs, they didn't know about the Romans or the Mings or what have you. And then suddenly they're interacting with them in a very full way. That's a system change. And the other system change that I think belies your general narrative of continuity, and particularly continuity of structures of domination, is really the globalization of the Westphalian system. Right? It pointed out that conquest empires and the regional systems have been the dominant form. Everyone thinks that. Toynbee, McNeill, et cetera, et cetera. And Europe is an anomaly in that it remains plural. And the Europeans were puzzled by this, and it was really in response to that puzzle that they invented international relations theory, centered on plurality. But regardless of the origins of it, this became the global system. It's not the Ming Empire globalized. It's not the British Empire globalized. It's the Westphalian system globalized. And so there is now, at the system level, a much deeper plurality than existed before. So the big story is domination eroding, right? And plurality and various forms of independence rising.
Thank you, Dan. Rosemary.
Thanks. I'll be very brief since I've had to go already, but I've been thinking about the relationship between dominance, authority, consent, and the term hegemony itself. And I think it's important in all the papers to see or to think about the degree to which a ruling system or an actor can actually develop a kind of legitimate hegemonic authority. I mean, I think it comes out in Arnie's paper, it comes out in Andrew's paper, and I was also struck by this kind of idea of consent, if you like, that is relevant to Natasha's paper and also to some of the things that Harold said. So I'm assuming that if an actor can develop legitimate hegemonic authority, then that will aid the persistence of certain hegemonic orders. And if I could just become a bit presentist for a moment, I think China, one of the problems with China is that it's found it extremely difficult to establish legitimate authority within its own region, that it's established dominance, but not authority and not consent. Whereas I think that the United States just about, I mean, despite the Trump era, just about retains its perceived status as a benign hegemon. So maybe the hegemonic order that Harold mentioned are quickly cast aside. They can hang on if you can retain some degree of consent for the role that you play within a particular region or within a particular international institution. Of course, it can be reflected that way.
That's great. So while the panelists are thinking about how they're going to respond to these questions, let me just add two from the chat. There's a question from Jim Dingman, which asks all of you to reflect. There was very little talk about the role of military systems and technology and doctrine in these orders. And so he asks, what role do these play? Are they essential or not to the periods that you were looking at? And then to Bob Cohane's question. So Bob is asking us to, asking you to reflect, and this really just picks up on Rosemary's point, I think, about the role of hegemony, and starting with the premise that is built into Gilpin and also Bob's own work, that hegemony is unstable. And so the question is, and I for all of you, and Andrew, I have in mind, I wrote down here that I know that it's kind of Whiggishness to focus on hegemony and its decline, but under what conditions does hegemony tend to be stable or unstable? And does it have something to do with the issue that Rosemary just raised about authority and kind of, the extent to which, it has kind of a staying power, I suppose, or Tolia's point really about kind of a common culture and that it is somehow embedded in that. At any rate, there's a lot on the table here. We've got, I think, a little over 10 minutes to work with. And I think maybe what we'll do with the panelists is, since Arnie, you had to go last the first round, you go first this time. And so why don't we start with you, and then we'll go to Natasha, and then to Andrew, and then to Harold.
That sounds entirely fair to me, Peter.
And you pick up whatever you want.
I will. So it's easy to link Tolia's, Rosemary's, and Bob's questions because they all deal with stability, with what is necessary in order to have stability, particularly perhaps in a hegemonic or at least under certain circumstances of predominance. Tolia phrased it and asking, is a common culture necessary for stability? Probably not. I mean, if you're asking that for the international orders that I've focused on this particular occasion, I don't think that's true. But there has to be, as someone put it recently, something to talk about. There has to be certain issues that would be framed in ways that it would be possible to recognize for the various participants within the order or within the system. And I think that's to go to Dan's point. I mean, that's of course what the Westphalian order in a way has delivered. It was also, I think, to a very high extent, what the Neo-Confucian order in Eastern Asia delivered for a very long period of time. So very often, and this is, I blame the realist tradition for this, we've got this backward in the sense that we start thinking about interest and we start thinking about, how this is played out with regard to specific priorities set by elites within various states. I think very often in these kinds of hegemonic settings, it is to a very high extent about culture, but it is about culture in terms of being able to engage each other in ways that are being seen as meaningful in terms of content. So the hermeneutical aspects of this, I think, are truly important, as was pointed out earlier. On Dan's point about globalization as making things fundamentally different, of course, at one level they do. But there is a danger in this, which is that we've only seen one kind of globalization so far, and that is very much a Western kind of globalization. And by saying that these other orders that we, in my view, should be looking at, non-Western orders, happen under circumstances of non-globalization in sort of totality, while undoubtedly true, I think do not disqualify them from, thinking about them within the kind of globes or universes or frameworks that they existed. I don't see, when you take the Eastern Asian order in the late 14th century as the starting point, as that being any less total, and in that sense global as the world being round, but global in terms of the known universe, than what you find later on. So I think these comparisons are still valid, although this is a point that we should obviously bear in mind in terms of the overall framework of the geographical zones that we are dealing with and the potentialities that are built into that.
Great, thank you. Natasha. Natasha with us?
Peter, she had to step out, so I think.
Oh, okay, that's fine. So why don't we'll go to Andrew and then Harold, and if she comes back, we'll pick her up at the end.
Okay, great. So many good questions, hard to distill, but I'm going to try to do so by focusing on this theme of hegemony and stability, and to try to contrast some of the historical material I covered with making observations about how stable or unstable hegemony is now. So the first set of questions seem to revolve around the issues of legitimacy and also the questions of culture. Now, I'm a bit boxed in on the culture front because I've just co-edited a book with Chris Roosmit, who will be with us tomorrow, that John also participated in, that had a pretty clear line on cultural diversity. And essentially the argument that we make in that book, and which relates to this conversation, is that cultures are inherently plural, so we can't talk about the idea of there being an organic cultural consensus as either necessary or sufficient to underpin international orders. But a point that we do make, and that also is borne out in the individual cases that I've looked at, is that it is important to curate authorised forms of cultural difference, that is to manipulate and harness cultural materials in a way that helps to legitimate particular configurations of political authority. So to the question in terms of the relationship between culture, hegemony, and questions of legitimacy, what I would suggest is that it's actually become harder to mobilise the consensus and to formulate a common conception of legitimacy necessary to underpin hegemonic orders. And to give a simple illustration of this, if we look at the way that the Manchus curated cultural difference to sustain their order, the Manchus were very good at being chameleons for different constituencies within the imperial order. So they could be a Confucian sage king to impress the Chinese. They could be a Khan to the Mongols. They could be a Bodhisattva to the Tibetans. And they could essentially silo their different legitimation strategies to configure that with particular needs of particular constituencies. I think just the nature of the democratization of the means of cultural meaning making has simply made that impossible in the contemporary context. And I think it touches upon Barry's point earlier of the deep pluralism of the current system. I think actually works against stabilizing hegemony in that way. Offsetting that, and this potentially speaks to some issues that Dan has raised, what I would suggest is that another potential vector for challenging hegemonic orders is disruptive over the horizon military innovations. And I think that those have actually become harder to develop with time. Again, by way of illustration, if we look at the way that the Europeans were able to mobilise militarily, they did have a niche blue water naval military advantage that they could use in order to harass at the edges and eventually build up their empires. Likewise, there were equivalent military innovations on the steppe that could enable you at particular points in time to overthrow a hegemonic order. I think it's much more difficult in the contemporary context to develop those system-changing military innovations now. So I'm having a bet each way. Culturally, it's harder to legitimise hegemonic authority. Militarily, it's harder to challenge. So I'm babbling. I'll stop there.
You're not babbling. That's great. That's terrific. Harold, I don't see Natasha on here, I guess. So you're going to get to close this out. John, I'm going to leave you with a minute or two, if there's any housekeeping and so forth at the end.
Thanks. I mean, just some very, very brief comments then. One on culture. So, I think the fissures in culture are not just between states, but within states. And I think there are genuinely more things that, for instance, the populist right has in common across Latin America, India, the Philippines, Europe, the United States, then you could say that they're in a cultural community, and there are other cultural communities. But the important point about culture today, I think, surely is that culture doesn't really coincide with state boundaries anymore, and it goes in very different ways. We have a culturally very disunited world, but that doesn't run really along the borders of states. Then I wanted to sort of relate the cultural question. What do we have in common? And one thing that I think is really striking, and it's odd that nobody has talked about it, because I think it really is at the core of a lot of the debates when you're thinking about what's unique about the United States, is that it's got the American dollar. And the American dollar is a world currency in the sense that no other currency is a world currency. The dollar unites us, but I think you can also think that that is fragmenting, and you can see very, very clearly over the last weeks particularly, but over the last months, the last years since the global financial crisis, really a push from China to think about, and from other countries, to think about alternatives to the long domination of the US dollar. And the US dollar, I mean, in a way, money and culture are not unrelated to each other. Money translates things in a way that culture does. And the idea of having a separate entity that is not the US dollar, but is also associated with all kinds of information. Money carries information. What you spend money on shows what your cultural values actually are. I mean, in that sense, you have a real manifestation of what we actually choose to be. So, this to me is one of the areas where you might think that there is going to be a radical change. That relates to a question that Arnie just raised. Is this Western globalization that we've been having? Yes, in a sense, it is Western globalization in some ways, in the way that the financial structures are set up. But it's not Western globalization in the sense of who can participate in it. So the story since the 1960s is really dramatic of countries moving from extreme poverty to upper middle income and beyond. You think of the trajectory of Korea. It's absolutely an amazing story. We shouldn't think of globalization as simply Western, but we should think of a part of the architecture, the financial infrastructure, which is really crucial in some ways because it's a real source of power, as reflecting one particular view that might, at the moment, I think, be vulnerable. And it's vulnerable because, not of what other countries are doing, but also because of what the United States may be doing. And thank you.
Great, thank you. So we've reached the bewitching hour, I guess. Fascinating discussion. Sets this panel and the one earlier set a very high bar appropriately for tomorrow's panelists. So that's great. John, any?
Thanks, Peter. Yeah,
I think we had something like 75 people on the platform at one point. So great turnout as well.
It's great. This has been a great panel. Thank you, Peter, for directing it. I will remember this panel for introducing into our debate the question of the character of domination in international orders, how it may change or be distributed across different historical eras and forms, and the role of institutions as in some instances fostering consent, and in other cases reinforcing hierarchy. I think we're kind of just at the brink of a more explicit discussion of that, and it may come tomorrow. And then modernity's role in the background, and which we bring forward from the first panel, and the various comments by Barry and Dan of what it's doing. Is it altering the way in which order is manifest, and therefore making it harder to compare orders across time, because things are just simply different. So we'll see everybody, I hope, tomorrow at East Coast time, 7 a.m. We will very much continue this format, and look forward to a conversation about inclusion and exclusion, and then the last panel on the social purposes or the ends of international order. So without further ado, I think we'll just let you either finish your morning, finish your afternoon, or we wish you well as you head for bed. Miles?
Miles has his hand up. Miles has a question. Miles, you're muted.
No.
He's frozen.
No, he's muted. No, it looks like he's unmuted. Anyway, I don't hear you.
He's frozen.
Tomorrow, Miles.
Or send
it in the chat, Miles. We can hang on for a second.
There's something in the chat about a picture taking.
Oh, I think maybe we'll do that.
I thought
yeah.
maybe Miles is referring to that.
Okay, I think I don't think we have enough people online. I think that Nikki from Peers wants to do a screenshot of everybody, but I think tomorrow may be a better time for this, so we'll do that.
We can do it tomorrow. We can do it tomorrow.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone. That's terrific.